Hi, everybody. Welcome to Parallel Universes, Puritan Congregationalism and Indigenous Society in the Eastern Woodlands with our board member and scholar, Lori Rogers-Stokes, who many of you know from past presentations and discussions, and how great she is. I want to say first that you need to be aware that this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on our website and on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. So have a look. If you missed part of it, you loved it so much you have to watch it again, or you want to share it with other people. And we'll put a link to the page on our website where you can find recordings of all our past events. So this is Parallel Universes is the first of our events, online events in 2023. And we think it brings in a new element to the work that we've been doing, because what Lori is doing is unique. Well, not unique, her research is unique, but she's looking at communities in terms of how people really live their lives. That is, they did not live in separate silos. There were relationships of domination, inequality, and so forth, but they lived more integrated lives. And we like, often history is presented as Puritans over here, Indigenous people over here, enslaved people over here, but actually they lived in communities together. So this is a fascinating look at one area of life where people came together in the Congregational church, Indigenous people and English colonists, or colonizers, I should say, using Lori's term correctly. And they came together and to see what that meant in practice. So those of you who don't know the Partnership of Historic Bostons, welcome to you. We are a very small, too small right now. We're looking for volunteers in the future. We are a small public history nonprofit based in Massachusetts, and our remit really is to explore all aspects of life and ideas and all the peoples of 17th century New England. So that means going back to the English roots, the Puritans, and what motivated them to come, and equally it means exploring the other voices that have not traditionally been suppressed or simply not heard: women, indentured servants, enslaved people, and Indigenous people. So we're exploring all of that, and so stay tuned for the coming year. We've got some really great things coming up. So just on the structure this evening, I should say, as always, we'll have about a 40-minute presentation by Lori, and then followed by about 40 minutes of Q&A. And ideally, you will put your questions into the chat. You can do this as we go along, or you can do this at the end, or you can, if you don't want to put your questions in the chat, you can sort of raise the little hand at the bottom of the chat, which you do. Now I've forgotten how you do this. Sorry. Gina, could you tell people how they raise their hand? Explain that in the chat.
Absolutely. So if you look at the bottom, there's something called reactions, and then you can click the raise hand button.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I haven't done this for a long time. And then we'll take the questions as they come in. So I just want to say a little bit about Lori, although many of you know her because she's been around and she writes for our website. She is an eloquent speaker, so you might be acquainted with her, but if you're not, she is an independent scholar, a public historian, a contributing editor for New England's Hidden Histories, which is a history project of the Congregational Library, which makes thousands of pages of colonial era congregational church records available in transcription, which is it's a treasure trove, and she's going to be drawing on that this evening. She is also the author of a remarkable book, really remarkable, called Records of Trial from Thomas Shepard's Church in Cambridge, Heroic Souls, which was published a couple of years ago by Palgrave Macmillan. She studies the history of Woodland New England, particularly the founding decades of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, when Indigenous people of the Eastern Woodlands began to preserve and protect their own history and identity, just at the moment when English Puritans were arriving and creating what they called New England, and created forms of church and state that shaped American history, as we know, for better and for worse, but unmistakably shaped the course of the United States and all the people within it. So I should say also, Lori is writing a book on the very topic that you're going to hear about now, and stay tuned for what happens with her book. So welcome, Lori. It's really nice to see you as always.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It is great to be here. I take it everyone can hear me. I'm going to chat to you directly for a moment, and then I'm going to share some slides. And then when I'm done, I'll get back on the full screen like this to take your questions. I am living and breathing congregational church records, and I hope that after this experience tonight, you might be interested in doing the same. You know, some topics of history seem to be pretty well covered, and then a new resource opens up, changes everything. So without delay, let me begin this presentation from where I sit in lands that the Pawtucket people belong to, and let me share a little bit about Congregationalism with you. I hope I'm sharing properly. I'm going to just make sure I'm sharing properly. There we go. Okay, take it everyone can see those slides, and I'm going to put my reflective glasses on because those allow me to actually read. And since I'm not on the big screen, it doesn't matter very much. My life as a scholar and a person living in the United States, everything was really changed by my involvement with being an editor and a transcriber for the Congregational Library's New England's Hidden Histories program. This is the little screenshot of their homepage. What I do is read. I've read thousands and thousands of handwritten pages of church records from Woodland, New England, from 1640 to 1878. These church records are, I believe, the most important, until now, untapped resource in American history, maybe in the history of the Atlantic world, maybe in the history of Atlantic colonization. What they are is that each congregational church, as I'll describe a little more later, kept records of every meeting they had, every decision they made, every process they went through, all their births, marriages, deaths, in their record books. And the same church might write in the same book for 150 years. They might refer back to a 1652 entry in 1801. These were vital records that were considered to almost be living entities before God. The amount of information they have is astounding, because until New England's Hidden Histories began traveling to churches all over New England and getting their record books and digitizing the pages and transcribing them, the records were just basically lost. Few people knew where they were. If you knew where they were, you had to be able to sit with the physical book and read it. Not many people can read the handwriting. Even if you digitize it, you've got to have a transcription available. So the work that NEH does is tremendous. And you can visit this link and just immediately start diving in to the world of these church records, which is where I've been and where I continue to be. Here is a page that is important to me from the church record book of Hassan Grafton, where you see on the left there, here, this is the page in the record book, and the thing in blue is the record of a Nipmuc man who became a full member of his church in 1738. On the right, you see that transcription. And you also see that I'm able to keyword search. Oh, so valuable to be able to keyword search 190 pages of handwritten records. So this is the source of all the work I'm doing, because as I sat for the last 10 years transcribing all these records, it began to dawn on me slowly that they were full of information that changes our understanding of our own history fundamentally. We haven't had a lot of congregational church, you know, the religion of the Puritans. When we talk about Puritan religion, we're talking about Congregationalism. And we've had, you know, a handful of records that were available to try to extrapolate from. And now we've got thousands of pages from hundreds of churches in dozens of towns. And it's opening up a new world of understanding for us. So as I read the church records, something that occurred frequently was records of church meetings where somebody in the church was having some kind of issue that might have bled over into civil courts, or maybe it did not. And I would read page upon page over days, weeks, months, years of the church trying to help this person work this problem out. I'll get into details about all the things that make Congregationalism made it able to do this, but it just dawned on me, overall big picture, that the civil society English colonizers created was like most civil societies around the world, legally based, political, economic, what we're all familiar with, what we live in now. Congregationalism, which was founded at the same time that this colony was completely different. It stood completely outside of all of that. It was based on spiritual kinship and oral culture, regular counsel between brothers and sisters, group consensus, and government by consent. How is it possible that the same people who developed the legal, political, economic system that didn't do any of that also created at the same time this religion that was so different from everything else they did? That's the parallel when I talk about parallel universes. If you went back to, don't go up there yet. If you went back in time to the colonizing period, you would have really seen, all the way up to, let's say, to 1800, you would have seen two different worlds in operation next to each other. And really, it began to dawn on me only after reading Lisa Brooks' amazing Our Beloved Kin, A New History of King Philip's War, and all of her descriptions of the Sanskwa and the Sachem, that Congregationalism may have had a lot more in common with Indigenous culture than English. This may have been part of the appeal of Congregational to Indigenous converts. And that was no one-way accident. It's because Congregationalism was created, shaped, evolved by Indigenous and English people who were practicing it. Right. So often when you read histories or you read about Congregationalism at this time, the Puritan religion, it's just assumed that it's all English. Or you'll read something that is about missionary work, and everything they'll describe about Indigenous people who chose to belong to Congregationalism, not all of them did. Everything they did is presented as, oh, this is just Indigenous. It wasn't common. But what I find as I go through church record books is that they really created a shared experience. Some congregations were all English, some were all Indigenous, many were mixed. In all three situations, all of these bullet points apply to both sides. Each one brought some pagan folk beliefs into their Christian practice. You never really read the English experience described that way, but it's exactly what happened. David Hall does write about this as well. They were both, a fundamental of becoming a Congregationalist was to reject your childhood upbringing in your traditional culture as sinful. This is not just something Indigenous people were told. You did cry a lot. You felt hopeless. You sought counsel. You hoped to discover assurance of grace or salvation. It was a very emotional practice. And lived experience and changing needs led to many changes in congregational doctrine. But overall, above all, it was about supporting each other in loving and reciprocal relationships. Whether you were English, Indigenous, or a mixed congregation, this was the rule, and it was the rule for all. Introduced by English believers, because they're the ones who came up with the idea of Congregationalism once they got here, but evolved by practice on both sides. The congregational church body is really the key to the innovations that made Congregationalism so unique and so different from civil society, secular society. Every town had a building in it where people would meet to worship. It was called a meeting house. Sometimes it was a building that served other purposes during the week, and on Sundays it was just a meeting house. That was not what they would ever call a church. A meeting house had a congregation in it. Everybody in a town was expected to show up on Sunday to worship, at least on Sunday, as part of the congregation. But a church was a unique body of believers gathered by God, who had all experienced what they believed they had experienced, assurance that they had salvation. This church body was not tied to any particular place. When the members of the church came together to worship, that was their purpose. It had nothing to do, they could have done that anywhere. They weren't tied to any building. The church body, everyone within it, was equally represented before God, all based on mutual kinship and reciprocal relation, and what they would have called mutual watch, and represented before God by their minister, who had no authority of his own. It wasn't a position of power where they could wield their power. They were called by a church. Their job was to represent that church as an invisible vessel to help them communicate with God. And all of his leadership skills that he practiced came from how well he represented those people. No unilateral decisions, we've all, maybe you've heard, if you've studied the Puritans a little bit, that the ministers controlled people with an iron fist and people were beaten down, and absolutely not the case, as you learn if you read Congregational church records. The Congregational Minister really reminded me, I feel the similarities between the role of the minister and the role of the Indigenous leader, the Sang Squaw or Sachem. They're called to serve by their people. They practice leadership. They mobilize people to work together. They don't just exert authority. No power outside of your role as a representative of others. The minister was meant to offer hospitality and to give away wealth, and to guide the all-important process of restorative justice. Now, I should say, and be very clear, that these similarities between congregational practice by English people, the similarities with Indigenous practice were not deliberate, they were not intentional. And I think if you were able to talk to any English congregational minister from that time and ask him, do you feel you have something in common with an Indigenous sachem, would not even know what you were talking about, would not have been able to even take that idea. And of course not, no way. I see the similarities because I'm studying this. This was not something any English, congregational minister really did. One or two, Stephen Badger in what we call Natick now was one, but it didn't mean that English people lived more like Indigenous people, or that this kind of reciprocal belonging and kinship was able to influence their secular society. That's why Congregationalism and its ideal were so doomed. It could not. It was marginalized immediately within its own society because it was so unlike secular society. So I'm able to perceive these similarities. They were not perceived at the time. The English people would not have welcomed it. At the same time, we just keep going through kind of parallel lanes here. English and Indigenous people practiced this same religion. And it just shows the power of blinders. If you are brought up as an English colonizer to believe that you have nothing in common with these people, Indigenous people, even though you're practicing the same religion that you brought to them, you'll believe it. So it's a good warning to us today not to do the same thing. I want to give you an example of what I've learned from church records about how very, very different the congregational way was from the secular way. We're going to look at two different adultery cases, one for Thomas Miller of Agawam Rowley and Nathaniel Kuchak of, I don't know exactly how to say it, Natick. In each case, we'll look at how I haven't found a civil court case for Nathaniel Kuchak yet, but we'll look at how the church approached a kind of social justice and how it worked this out. So Thomas Miller, his case runs for 8 years through the church records of Agawam Rowley. 8 years they worked with this man to try to get him to a place of real repentance and restoration. We are used to thinking of Puritan religion as very punitive. Like they just wanted to excommunicate people and punish people, and they were cracking down on people all the time. When really what they practiced was something I like to call rebuke, repent, restore. If someone is a member of the church body, they are a limb of that body and they are doing something wrong, that is a threat to the whole body. That's a diseased limb. You not only need to heal that limb for its own sake, but for the sake of that body. So what the church way was that if somebody really goes off the rail, like Thomas Miller or Nathaniel Kuchak did, it's not enough that they get some punishment in court. It's not even enough that they say, I'm sorry for what I did. Everybody has to be restored to reciprocal relationship. Everybody needs to be heard, and everyone needs to come to restoration together. So you rebuke somebody so that they will truly repent, and then you bring everyone to a full restoration, no matter how long it takes. And with Thomas Miller, it took 8 years. The court in Hartford, Connecticut colony that he appeared in when he committed adultery with a woman who was working as a servant in his household. The court has 2 records. They're both very brief. This is from the second one. The first one says, yes, he admits that he committed adultery with Sarah Nettleton. She's pregnant with his child. He's going to be fined and whipped, and she may be too. The second entry has this in it. Considering the estate of Thomas Miller and the desire of his wife, lately deceased, his wife Isabel was dead, in reference to the wrongs done to her by his notorious uncleanness, the court sees just cause to allow Anna Bacon, his daughter who was married to a man named Nathaniel Bacon, to allow Anna all the wearing apparel, linen and woolen, with other small things mentioned in the inventory, and out of that estate 30 pounds more. This is to be a final issue of all the demands that Anna Bacon may make upon any account for things past. As far as civil society was concerned, this case was closed in a just way. Thomas Miller is publicly called out as having committed adultery. He's convicted of this crime. He has to be fined and whipped. He was temporarily disenfranchised. And he has to give his daughter a considerable amount of money, 30 pounds out of his estate, and valuable clothing. What more could you ask for? She should be happy, right? Oh, his church in Agawam Rowley was not happy. The church hears about this case and they write to him. And again, this took 8 years overall to resolve. And they wrote and said, brother, sit down and ask yourself, what have you done? Did you not hasten the death of your wife now at rest? Judge yourself now, that you not be judged of the Lord another day, when every secret thing shall be brought upon you. The church body was relentless in bringing up and pursuing something that the court just kind of tossed off in one line, like, oh yeah, his wife had wrongs done to her. They said, it's not enough, Thomas, that you say that you are sorry because you put your own soul in such danger of committing a sin like this. You have to care more about the harm you did to your wife. That's the problem here. It's the harm you did her, not yourself, that is primary. And until you really see that and repent of it, There's no way that you can be restored to our church body, because everybody is going to be thinking, he's not even sorry. He drove his wife to an untimely death. And he wrote them back. He refused to come in person to the church. Everything had to be done in person. And he said, well, you know, I went to her before she died and asked her to forgive me. So, and she did, so it's fine. He said, you know, she chose to forgive you, even though you clearly don't seem to have really deserved it. And her choosing to forgive you is not the same thing as you acknowledging that what you did to her was worse than what you did to yourself. So eventually, after, I don't remember how long, 2-3 years, they did excommunicate him. The church passed that dreadful sentence of excommunication. They had to write him a letter because he wouldn't appear in person. That your repentance is not thorough appears in that you judge not yourself for blood guiltiness in respect of your carriage to your former wife, but rather you lay the blame on her rather than yourself. You're under great guilt as to shortening of your wife's life, and it will not be easy to undo by repentance what you have done by sin. Even this heavy excommunication was just an emergency form of rebuke. If somebody could not come to repentance, you had to up the ante on rebuke. But no church wanted to excommunicate a member. That is like cutting off that limb. The church will never be whole again. And they kept working with him. 2 churches in 2 places, he was by then living in Connecticut, worked and worked together and with him to try to get him to a place where he could actually really repent. And 8 years later, he finally did. And he appeared before his church, sisters and brothers in Rowley. And he said, yeah, the real thing here is that I drove my wife to an early death. And he was eventually restored in a way that made everyone truly whole again. When you consider, you know, I sat and transcribed for months the number of pages that filled the Agawam Rowley Church book to cover this. Compare that to maybe this much of one page if you put it all together in the Hartford Secular Court Records. You see a society on 2 very different tracks. One of these tracks was going to be deemed unsustainable and marginalized and finally gotten rid of, and that is the church way. And we are left with the secular way. The second adultery case was that of Nathaniel Kuchak in Natick. This is from the Natick church records. And this didn't take as long. This took about a year. With Nathaniel Kuchak, what? Goodness. A committee was sent to him by the church body to talk with him. It was all about counsel, talk with him in private. And they reported they had twice discoursed with him, and he seemed too rough and did not much care for the discipline of the church. What he is charged with is adultery. So the church voted to adjourn its meeting because he didn't appear at that meeting to speak for himself, and send to him that if he doesn't then or before make satisfaction, which would be appear before the church to talk with them, then we will proceed according to gospel rule, which would be to start the mechanism of an admonition, which could blow up into an excommunication. Deacon Ephraim and Brother John Goodenow were desired to inform Kuchak of this. Deacon Ephraim was another Indigenous man, as Nathaniel Kuchak was, and John Goodenow was English. So this is a mixed congregation and a mixed mission to this member. So in June, the church met, and Nathaniel, Brother Kuchak, does show up, and he asks if we can have more time. He needs more time for the work of repentance. And they said, okay, we'll wait a month. Then for our last entry in July, he offered a very humble confession of his sin of intemperance and adultery. After it was read twice, the question was put whether the church judges this to be gospel satisfaction, real repentance. This passed to the affirmative. This question was then put before the church, whether they receive him into their Christian charity and communion, passes in the affirmative. There was no problem that a church body could not solve if they had enough time and they had enough patience. And the church records are filled with stories like this. Like, I can't find a court record for Nathaniel Kuchak. Maybe his adultery case never went to trial. Thomas Miller was in the 1670s. This is in the 1720s. Maybe it didn't go to trial. You would never know about Nathaniel Kuchak or the work of his mixed church body to bring restoration to the church and the congregation and the society in that town without these congregational records. Which side of this one? I think we know because of the world we live in today, right? That the church way was merged, forcibly merged, marginalized into the civil way. And again, this is why I talk about parallel universes. The English people who we call Puritans who came over here were not faking it. They weren't just using a religious purpose as a cover for colonization and wealth making. They were sincere in their religious purpose, and they accomplished things like codifying the congregational way into a set of descriptions of their belief and their practice in 1648. They did things that Protestants back in England were never able to do. They successfully practiced an ideal of the church body and restorative justice and mutual spiritual kinship that, you know, it makes us think of the Constitutional Convention, where people said, can you really take the ideal of democracy and really live it out in the real world? Congregationalism was a very idealistic way, and it was lived in the very real world very successfully. At the same time that the secular, you know, political, economic society also plowed ahead, thrived, you know, only grew and grew. The same people. I'll read a church record and start to recognize names, and then I'll see those names in the civil court. People who practiced the church way and restorative justice in their church body were taking each other to court, tooth and nail, cut throat, willing to do anything, say anything to make a profit. Both things are happening, and I don't have a good take on how that's possible, except that human beings are able to compartmentalize what we do. And eventually that congregation ideal was marginalized by people saying, it just means that I should have a conscience. You know, I'm going to do the things I'm going to do, but I'll just have to have a conscience about it. And that is not what the congregational way was about. And you will read, many of the records are about church members who are embroiled in secular crimes, adultery. There's another record in Natick of a church member who forged a deed. And, you know, this would have been dealt with pretty quickly in a civil court. Like, you forged a deed, okay, it's invalidated, you're fined and done. They worked with this person for a long time. Like, how could you do this? Why would you do this? You understand that the problem wasn't that you were caught, right? This became harder and harder and harder to do as this way became marginalized, as the drive for wealth that is colonization, you know, overcame all, as it usually does. Colonization made congregationalism possible, but it also guaranteed it would be marginalized. It's a sad story. I mean, I'm not trying to paint a completely rosy picture of Congregationalists were all making flower necklaces and, you know, holding hands together. They lived in the real world and they participated in the secular world, but there was a real attempt to create something different. If they had been able to sustain that, we'd be living in a very different world in 2023. We'd be living in a world based on collaboration, kinship. We would not be, you know, living in a world that's being driven, has been driven a little bit past the brink of destruction environmentally. these opportunities are not completely lost. The Congregational Church as it existed for about 200 years is no more, but the invitation to do this collaborative work is still there. And one of the goals of doing this kind of research, going through these records, getting this word out there, is just, you know, it's so hard to do kind of what if history. It used to be really frowned on. What if, you know, what if it hadn't turned out? What if the Titanic hadn't sank? What if the South had won the Civil War? It used to be like, don't do that. But I think it's a fruitful question to ask sometimes. Instead of kind of believing that everything is inevitable, there was a way to create a different path. Congregationalism, they called it the Congregational Way. That was a way that was used to create a completely different society for European colonizers. It had strengths that were appreciated by many Indigenous people, and it was a potential bridge. And even though Congregationalism itself and its way are gone, that potential bridge is there in other ways if we can recognize new invitations to that kind of collaboration. Again, I say go to New England's Hidden Histories and take a look at the records there. It's more browsable now because of the transcriptions and the ability to search. And there's a special section that is about BIPOC churches. There's all sorts of things that you can find. It's a huge, huge repository. And even if you're just, I shouldn't say just, even if you're interested in family history, I mean, I have spent, 700 hours sitting at this desk typing birth, marriage, and death records. So much more complete than anything you're going to find in vital records for towns. If you look at the town vital records, which is a thing in Massachusetts, vital records for the town of Grafton, you're not going to find about 2/3 of the Indigenous people who are actually living in the town at that time. Church records are very different. And I kind of wrap up by saying, again, not to idealize, there were plenty of congregational ministers. I'm sure most of them were, they did not think of Indigenous people as their equals, but when you go into the church records, that was a different thing for them. That was a record before God. And it's actually a wonderful relief when you're reading colonizing era records to go to some that don't pass judgment. They just record what happened. Nobody is judged for being Black, enslaved, Indigenous, criminal. They just lay it there. They show you what's happening. They treat everybody as equal brothers and sisters before God. Everyone is given the same amount of attention. And it's just a completely different window. It's better than reading civil records, which are all about blame and prejudice and stereotype. And that's about it, really. There's civil records, there's church records, and then there's the secondary body of work done by historians who didn't have access to church records. And so if you're interested in anything about Woodland New England in the colonizing period, right up through, some of these churches kept records from 1640 to Reconstruction. Go to your town, find your town, look it up. It's a great place to begin, just taking a look around, and you can really come to some powerful conclusions about how things are. As you see here, those are all the towns. Just in Massachusetts, we have them for Maine and Connecticut and Rhode Island, like all over what is now New England. Church records, personal papers, etc. So I don't work for the Congregational Library. I am part of the Partnership of Historic Bostons. And as always, you can see much more about much more at the partnership website, where all of these concerns about hearing voices that have so far been unheard are front and center. And my connection to take away a parallel between my work and my work in the partnership is that these church records really do help us to hear unheard voices, which is a focus that the partnership has last year, this year, who knows, into the indistinct future. So that is it for me, and I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay. Hey, Lori, that was fantastic. That was really great.
Thank you.
I want to encourage everybody to put their questions into the chat. We only have a few so far because we had a lot of toing and froing about audio access.
Yeah, I saw that some people were not able to hear. I was keeping one eye on that. I hope people could hear.
I'm going to repeat what I said at the beginning, which is in a couple of days, we will have, we'll post the recording of the entire presentation on our website under events. And I'll also be sending out a survey for you all to take and a link to the recording. You can see all our past events on the past events section of our website. So have a look at that. So if you have missed anything, you have a second chance. So a couple of questions have come up. One was not a question so much as a general questioning of the role of the church from someone who says that in her research into her family, she found that the church punished strangers by, I think it was whipping them and sending them out naked out of the town. Now, this is something I've never come across in my research, but I'm wondering if you could, this is, I think, a really common belief that in the punitive nature of the church. And I wonder if you could comment it, because it's very much at odds with the picture that you're painting.
And I think there's also, there's a whole backstory of kind of misunderstanding. And again, I don't really blame anyone for a misunderstanding. When you don't have access to the primary sources, you're not going to get the whole story. And so we tend to collapse the Puritans. We think they had a theocracy. We think that their government was run by their ministers and that it was a theocracy. And so if somebody was stripped and whipped and run out of town, it must have been the minister who did it or their church. That would be secular justice. You see from even these examples I gave, that is not how a church. First of all, a church would have nothing to do with somebody who was a stranger. A church only dealt with its own members. So a church did nothing to somebody who was a stranger in town. Second, if they were a part of the church, they went through this long restorative process that would never involve physical punishment. We see in the civil record for Thomas Miller, he was stripped to the waist and whipped at least 10 times, as the record says. He was fined. He was disenfranchised. Part of his estate was seized. But that is not what his church did.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then the second question, and then I have a question, which is, could you say somebody thanking you for your really unique research, but also asking, what about the role of women in the church?
Yes, women could, of course, become church members. And from the start, from the 1630s, all the way through, there were always more female members than male. Part of that may have been that originally, if you became a church member, not just a member of the congregation, but a full church member, and you were a man, you then had an obligation for political service. You had to vote, you could serve in the government, and so maybe some men didn't want to do that. We don't know exactly why that is. So we just know that most churches were made up of a majority of women, but this is, the world we live in. Then as now, women were marginalized. They were not allowed to serve on church committees. They didn't attend church meetings. The usual workaround is probably that women were able to influence proceedings by talking to their husbands, about what was happening in the church meeting, but they were not allowed to take an active role in that process. If it was a big, long case like Thomas Miller's, or I'm thinking of certain things that happen in Hassanemeset, Grafton, that involved the whole church, like the whole community, I'm sure that they had informal input, but it was only informal. And that's one of the huge differences stark differences that I meant to bring up between the English minister and the Indigenous Sangskwa or Sachem Indigenous societies had female leaders and English did not.
A related question is whether Native women appear in the church records. And I know you've written about that one example for our website, which was a really powerful article, which I would refer everyone to.
They do, again, not as actors like members of committees or meeting in church meetings, but as members of the congregation. I'm thinking of a group of women who are about the same age in the 1720s and 30s who were from the Printer and the Abraham families in Hassanesset, Grafton. And the civil record has many, many entries for them when they had to sell land because they were indebted. Nothing about them as human beings, just like these Indian women asked leave to sell land because of the debts they ran up, because that's what those people do, is either said or implied. And in the church records, you see them as real people who joined the church, who brought their children for baptism. Some of them chose never to join. I think of Abigail Printer, chose never to join the church, but she married Andrew Abraham Jr., who was very dedicated, became a full member, baptized his children there. And you see one young woman who had a baby out of wedlock, who that baby was never baptized in the church and she doesn't appear again. And another Indigenous woman, same thing, baby out of wedlock. She was restored. Her baby was baptized. She was eventually married to the father of the child in that church. You learn so much about these women through these records. Like they sold their land to, what was his name? Hezekiah something. He was a fellow church member. You'd think that maybe he might have done something to help those women out before they got so indebted that they had to sell land. He did not do that. So he was not practicing the true congregational way. He should have been called out about that. But at that point, Hassanesset Grafton had a horrible, horrible minister who was dedicated to destroying that church body. And so he let that happen. So you go from just a few records where like, oh gosh, it's another Indigenous woman who's forced to sell land, to getting this whole story. I could go on and on. I often do.
We like it, don't worry. So another question is, can you comment on Caleb's Crossing, the novel by Geraldine Brooks, relative to your presentation?
I don't know it. I need someone to comment on it for me. Do you know it?
I haven't read it. I've read her book on EM, which is fantastic, A Year of Wonders. But no, I haven't read Caleb's Crossing.
Shoot, I have to, that's
maybe
it's not a church record, right? That's why I haven't read it.
Maybe Kate and Peter, you could put the link, put a link to it in the chat so everybody can have a look.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you. I'm sorry, I can't.
Okay.
Whoever sent that in could tell us a little bit about it in the chat.
Yeah, that would yeah, put a link in and yeah, tell us about it. Another question: are there detailed church records for congregations in the so-called praying Indian towns prior to King Philip's War, and what happened to those churches after the war? Let's say in any of Natick and any of the other towns.
That's a tough one. Those towns had Indigenous churches, and so they had church record books, and we know that the one in Natick was written in Massachusetts. The English minister who came in 1752 talked about seeing it. Unfortunately, King Philip's War cost many Indigenous lives, including of those churches. And the only one I've ever heard that anyone even saw was that one in Natick. They were lost. They were probably deliberately destroyed. And then you get things like the church record book in Hassanesset Grafton, where when a new church was gathered after the war, they say, oh gosh, there was some kind of Indian church here before, but they didn't keep a record book. Like, they did. But it was lost, it was destroyed. It could still be out there. I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, Jeff Cooper, who began New England's Hidden Histories, traveled to churches all over Woodland, New England, and found records in attics and behind Christmas ornaments and on the wet floor of basements, stuffed into bank vaults, underneath the secretary's desk, by the space heater. These record books could be hidden away somewhere, just need to be found and digitized and brought back to us. But for now, we don't have those, unfortunately.
So there's a comment, coming back to the question of, punitive measures taken in Puritan towns. Someone comments that in colonial Westchester, people were tarred and feathered and were stripped, but this was more political than religious.
Yeah,
And I think
again,
it was more part of the revolutionary period than earlier on, but that's my
and again,
view.
if you're not part of the church, if you're just a member of the congregation and you attend worship services, you're not going through all of this that the church body does. You are only participating in the civil secular justice system, which would be the majority of people.
So this is a great question. Could you say that the Puritan legacy could be traced through time in, for example, 19th century reform movements and on up through church involvement in the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century?
Well, I'm taking a look at it again.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in this, but I'm not feeling a real straight line. Simply because by the time Congregationalism was split into the Unitarian Church and the Congregational Church, the ideal really just vanished into almost nothing. And I think that 20th century civil rights movements, my feeling is that they're not very much indebted to that. But again, I'm not an expert in that.
Could you say a little bit more about the church itself, the people who were able to make communion, the parish and civil society, and the town?
Yes, this is another thing that church records are making a lot more clear to us. We had only the testimony of one man named Letchford from the 1660s who spent, like, I think 10 years maybe in Woodland, New England, who said, oh, just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of any of the people ever become church members. It's an oligarchy. It's unfair. What we find as you go through 10,000 pages of church records is that far, far more people were church members. They weren't just part of the congregation. It was the law in Massachusetts for a long time that you had to attend Sunday services. That was the law. Congregation. The church was for people who were spiritual seekers, who went through a long spiritual process to understand whether they were saved. And then you had to be able to stand up and orally tell your story. Like, here's what I went through that tells me this. And then you would be accepted into the church. And it was, again, this wonderful reciprocal thing. It wasn't that the church sat in judgment, like, well, I believe your story or I don't. The church's ability to welcome somebody in validated that person and the church. The person was able to join as a new limb, and the church was able to recognize and accept the new limb. They needed each other. This was the beauty of it. So everybody in town, there's 200 people in town, they're all going to congregation, they're all going to meeting house. Let's say 40% of the families have a church member, at least one in them, 40 to 60, depending on your town. So that's roughly the numbers I would give for that.
So are you, this is a rather posed in a sardonic way, but I think a really valid point, which is, and you touched on this a bit earlier, which is a comment, I guess the thousands of militiamen who took part in the 79 Scalp Bounty Acts, which killed untold Native people and were issued by Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Nova Scotia from 1674 to 1760 did not belong to the loving Congregational Church. And I would add, did not prevent people, and hundreds of people being sent to Deer Island, and where they died during King Philip's War.
Or all of those Congregationalists who were Indigenous being sold into slavery, killed, imprisoned, left for dead. I mean, this is the lost.
War was made up of people who belonged to the church.
Calling it a lost opportunity is, it's just does it more than a disservice.
Mhm.
This is the nightmare, that you had the chance to do something very different. But I talk at the start of the book I'm working on, the opportunities for wealth and power that colonization offered and always offer were overpowering to English people who already suffered a lot of psychic baggage. And when they came here, they were unable to accurately perceive the world. And they went all in, full headlong into the maw of money grabbing, land grabbing, war, domination. At the same time that they were establishing this completely 100% different congregational way. You can't do both. You cannot do both. And so stories that say, well, you know, over time, the church became less powerful. It was from the start, this was the horrible tension, which was going to win. People wanted both. I want this congregational way. That's why I left England for my religious beliefs. But I want, here's a chance to have untold wealth. I can do both.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the horrible crimes that were committed by people who were church members. And this is what hurts. You know, like I said, you read about people doing restorative justice in their church, and then you find out it's Daniel Henchman, you know, who massacred people during King Philip's War. Like, what the hell? How? Why? It's bad.
Yeah, another question on the division between civil society and the church. When people like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were kicked out of Boston, was that the decision of the government, or was that the decision of the church?
In both cases, that was the civil government. Roger Williams' church was trying to hold him, but he was abandoning the congregational way. And so they wanted to hold him, but couldn't. Anne Hutchinson was banned by the secular government, and then her church excommunicated her. Again, as we see, she's a good example. They excommunicated her, and then they went to her several times to say, would you like to work with us so you can be restored? And she said no. So even that excommunication was not meant to be permanent on her. Her church didn't see it that way.
I'm not sure. There's a question about, is there much about ministers? I think this person is looking for an individual who was there. I'm not sure what there refers to. 5 years and left in 1868.
If you know the town you're looking for, you
Yeah.
can go to Hidden Histories. They won't have every single town, but you can go and take a look. And then like you could keyword search some of them for if you know the name. Otherwise, you do have to do some paging to get up to the years that you're looking for. But generally, something in the mid-19th century will be at the end of a church record book. So you can do a little searching around in that.
So Roxanne asks whether there was any advantage in the secular world to being a member of the church.
No, there really wasn't. That was one of the problems. We kind of appreciate their forward-thinking decision to separate church and state by not letting ministers serve in the government, and by saying, if you're in a mess with your church and you've been excommunicated, that doesn't mean you lose your political office. Mm-hmm. We get that as a good separation of church and state, but it's one of the things that furthered this, that I could commit crimes that my church was trying to work through with me, and it didn't impact my position in secular society. It didn't threaten that.
I want to ask a question, which is, you mentioned earlier that the Indigenous role within the church helped to shape Congregationalism, or the congregates themselves of whatever background helped to shape Congregationalism. Can you give us some examples of that?
One example I think of right away is that the Wampanoag Congregationalists on Nopi, Martha's Vineyard, were among the first to say, you know what, I think this whole thing where you have to tell a story about how you got assurance that you were saved, I don't think we need it. I think what we can do is just rely on our kinship with each other to let people into the church. They were among the first to just do that. They were able to do it very quickly. It took English churches decades to get there, each driving toward the same thing, but the Indigenous Congregationalists were practicing it first. And Experience Mayhew, who is writing about them, notes this. He's like, they have a different definition of a full member, which soon became everyone's definition of a full member. But that's one thing I think of where Indigenous innovation was ahead of English, but was adopted by English and mixed congregations.
That's an amazing example. Okay, a couple more questions. Is there much about Peter Hobart required? Was there much about, sorry, that's very light where I am. Was there much about Peter Hobart and the church in Hingham and its relationship to Hull?
Take just a quick look. I didn't do the Hingham records. Let me just take a look because I've got the page open to see if Hingham is in the church record page on Hidden Histories. Hanover, Harwich, Haverhill. No, Holden, Hopkinton, Hull. So it's not in NEH. I can't refer you there, and I don't know a lot about him.
Okay. Another question. Let's see. What was required of ministers? What was the education for church, for ministers?
Pretty quickly after Harvard College was founded, it was ideal if you were a graduate of the college. Harvard College, no English school. It had to be a school in Congregational Woodland, New England. And that was like your qualification to say, I would like to be called as a minister. You could get a degree from the college and not be a minister. You were not a minister until you were called by a church. The church authorized you, and it was their calling you into that role that made you a minister. Mm-hmm. So someone might preach to a church for a long time, for years, before he was ordained as their minister. So I think they would say, what was your qualification to be a minister? You were called by a church body and to represent them before God and other churches. That's what made you a minister.
Another question was, this is something about John Wayne, which maybe is a typo. So a recent book tied much of the present disarray and disunity in church, not only to greed, but also to a culture of violence, particularly patriarchy. How were violence and patriarchy influential in the breakdown of the congregational way?
I think the violence, there's already patriarchy inside the way, though I will say that while town records always skip the name of women, who was the mother of that child? What was that daughter's name? Who was that wife? Congregational records always name women, but it was still patriarchal. Violence, again, you would go to extreme lengths to remedy and restore violence that happened within your church body while you were in a militia that was killing Indigenous people. So again, to split like that, made a lot of bad things possible. And just everything, economics, politics, all became bigger than religion in this way. And it turned into what we're more familiar with, religion today, like a part of society, that can give you some meaning in life, but we don't expect it to change anything. We really don't. We're surprised when some religious movement actually changes things. It's not how Congregationalism started, but that's the path it went down.
How does Congregationalism as a model for civil order apply to governance beyond the congregation? You talk about land grabbing, but how did Massachusetts congregation, how did their values apply to what they did west of the Appalachian Mountains? That's sort of beyond our area.
Well, Congregationalism,
or even within Massachusetts,
very little influence outside of Woodland.
Yeah. So, but the values, we're coming back to this question again. The values are about kinship and a true spiritual life and facing yourself in the depths of your being. The practice is the Pequot War, annexation of land, and King Philip's War.
Yeah, it was supposed to the ministers were called to advise the government frequently in the colonizing period, and they did. It didn't mean the government had to follow that advice, and it often did not, because it was not a theocracy. And secular government was always kind of looking for the church's blessing without following the church's way. And again, maybe because it was such an ideal that even the people practicing it, they practiced it in the real world. They dealt with real world problems like forgery and stealing and drunkenness and adultery, but it was always kind of playing catch up. Like, we can't establish it's a big answer. John Winthrop wanted to do this instead of having a legal code, is my short answer. When they said, let's have a legal code, he said, no, let's not. Let's keep doing it this way, where each individual situation is dealt with on its own merits individually. And you don't just say, oh, this crime, it's this punishment. And he was overruled. That's really when it all went downhill. That was the chance for the religious way to influence and oversee the secular way. And people just said, we can't do it that way. We'll never get anything done. Hundreds of people go to court every year. Are we going to take 10 years with each one of them? No, it's not efficient. And that was the moment that was lost.
I would say in defense of the code of laws is that it was carried over from England, the belief in the Magna Carta and the importance of codified rights and the body of liberties is in 1641. So there is something to be said for that as well.
At the time in 1639, Winthrop just said, who among us is the expert who can even do this?
Yeah.
Do you have this kind of knowledge? The only way I can figure out what to do with you is if I hear your story and I hear all the other people, the 40 other people who are involved, and we work on it together. The idea that it's a one-way street where you appear before me and I decide, that he felt like, who has the authority here to do that?
Somebody notes that there's a parallel in this discussion to Nicole Eustace's Covered with Night, which
that's a great book.
A fiction, I assume from the title,
no.
set in Eastern Pennsylvania. So the idea of restorative justice was something the Five Nations and other tribes believed in.
Yes, and the records there that she uses so well really show that, Englishmen were responsible for the death of an Indigenous man. And so the English government said, look, we'll execute those guys. We've got you, we'll execute them. They're gone. And the Indigenous people said, that is not helpful for us. That is not what we want. What we want is restoration, basically. We don't want their families to be driven into poverty and despair. And it doesn't do anything for our grieving people. If you kill more people, that's not what we're looking for. And so it is one a good in-depth example of the same principle. You see Indigenous people practicing of it, of let's get to a real resolution and restoration here, and not just, more violence. It's not helping us.
This is obviously I've got it wrong. This is a book of history.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll send out the references to some of the books that have been mentioned in the follow-up email.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, that would be great. Question about why didn't John Eliot protect Native Americans? Well, particularly at Natick, instead of taking them to Watertown and then to the Deer Island and other islands?
Well, Eliot and Daniel Gookin actually came very close themselves to being mobbed because they were standing up for the people from their Indigenous praying towns. And it was a mob mentality. Like, no, we need to kill some Indigenous people. And if you're going to defend them, maybe we'll just kill you too. Here's Eliot, an elderly and respected minister, and his life was not safe because he did what he could, but there was no way that anyone was going to stop that from happening. And Eliot and Gookin were lucky. The most they could do was to have certain men released because they said, well, we can use them as spies or messengers. Like again, push come to shove, especially if you're in a war, there's no way that the congregational way was going to win out over the brute force of, a war.
That is the tragedy. Yep, you see it. Yeah. So in essence, you're saying there was a moment when if people had kind of stopped having the blinders, they might have seen what was possible. Do you feel that you saw that anywhere in the church records, that any sense of interaction, or the records are simply a record of marriages, baptisms, and so forth?
Well, what do you mean interactions with who?
Well, that did you get any sense of people recognizing others, Indigenous English people recognizing Indigenous people as holding their same values? Do you have any sense of interaction?
Only in those congregations like Natick and Hassanamis at Grafton that were mixed, where you have English and Indigenous people on committees together. You have them, in the same entry for like July 18th, 1701, you have English and Indigenous people being baptized or owning the covenant or becoming full members of their churches. In Ebenezer Parkman's diary, he was the minister in Westboro. He records a conversation he had with an English church member who was talking about his relationship with an Indigenous church brother and some questions, about that relationship. So it was so assumed like that they were going to be represented as the same kind of thing in those records that it's rarely called out as, hey, look, this committee was mixed. It had, Nipmuc and English people in it. Like that was just how it was. So again, in Hassanamis at Grafton and Natick, that church was broken down by, in each place, a minister who was working to break that down. Unfortunately, it was breakable. It was really breakable.
Roxanne asked a question about how somebody's ethnicity is conveyed in the church records.
It was always stated if somebody was not white. You might be Negro or mulatto or Indian or Irish. Those people were also identified always as such. Yeah. And if a minister forgot to put in Indian, they'd insert it later. Like, oh, George Muckamug became a full member. Oh, yeah, Indian. Yeah. Always mentioned. For us, it's a good thing because it makes these people visible. I would never know that somebody, named Abigail Smith was Indigenous because the name doesn't, appear to be Indigenous unless it was written Indian by her record. Why? Primarily to call out the racial differentiation. The English people who always did that, but also partially just to, to represent, like this is a mixed congregation, that's possible. It may, God has granted salvation to everybody, not just white people. Look at these Black and these Indigenous people also found assurance. So they wanted to call that out.
So I found myself wondering, if you physically go into a meeting house, how are people seated? Do you have the leading families at the front? Do you have Indigenous people and Black people at the back? Well, how do you have any sense of this?
Yes, that's unless the church was majority Indigenous, like in Natick, it would be segregated like that. Women on one side, men on the other. Working backward from the front or down the sides, depending, or if there was a gallery, that's like, we're all equal brothers and sisters in this church body, but we're sitting in different places and women don't sit with men. And also just the whole idea that you could be
ranking, wealthy families at the front, or is there?
Yeah. And that's one thing, a huge thing I haven't even talked about. If you were Black or Indigenous, you could be accepted as somebody who had been saved by God and still be enslaved by, somebody else, maybe even in the church. It's inexplicable, except that people were so willing, to believe the same thing we'll say now, which is, well, on this earth, things are a certain way. And I guess, when we all get to heaven, it'll be different. But for now, it's this way. Like, how can you enslave somebody who you think is your brother or sister in the assurance of salvation by God? I mean, Congregationalism was brand new. It was not centuries old. It didn't have heft and a long history of practice to stand behind it, to bulwark it against the every man for himself onslaught that was colonizing. It was new, it was experimental, it was idealistic, and it got trampled. And it was never completely pure. There was always slavery within it.
Mm-hmm.
So, it really represented an ideal partially realized and then very quickly marginalized. And where you see it working, it's beautiful, I think. Where I see it working, where Indigenous and white and Black people are all working together for restoration, that's what I wish, had been able to come out of this melee of colonization, but that's never going to happen. Colonization mows down anything that isn't about, individual wealth and profit. And I can't think of anything that can withstand that onslaught, except for the Indigenous societies who were subjected to colonization, who have been able to maintain their societies based on reciprocity in a way that non-Indigenous societies have not.
Okay, I'm going to ask last two questions. How much of Congregationalism actually started in England?
The origins of it were in England, in that, Puritans were Anglicans who thought that it wasn't different enough from Catholicism. But really, it was not until those people came here to the Eastern Woodlands that they very quick, like that, really created Congregationalism. It was not practiced in England. It was not practiced until they got here. This was the impetus. They had to be here so they could be politically free to do it. And so it's the idea, the hope and dream that we could figure out, like, wow, what if we were free to worship God properly? What would that look like? That was the thinking in England. When they got here, they're like, okay, this is what it's going to look like. This is it.
Last question. There was a point about restorative justice and how to facilitate restoration after the failure of the congregational way. And the other is that in one of your slides, you recommend that we accept Indigenous invitations to do the work of reversing the inheritance of oppression. Can you specify some ways that can be done? So they're both about restorative justice, really.
Right.
Referenced in,
someone asked earlier, was there any through line from Congregationalism to, the civil rights movements of the 20th century? And I don't really think there was a straight line. I think there is a straight line from Indigenous societies that have managed to maintain their unique, I can't think of another word except society. I'm kind of at the end of my brain space here, but I have been lucky enough to meet Indigenous people. And what I've constantly found is that, we're always welcome to go to a powwow. We're always welcome to attend a celebration. The invitation is always there to come together. And I think, everything from the ecology movement, to Black Lives Matter, gay and trans, everything that's been good about expanding, what we think of as civil rights, which are, political, legal rights. We don't think of it as religious. Everything that's been good about that has been coming from people who have said, let's remember that we're all brothers and sisters and we need to be in relationship with each other, reciprocity. And so those opportunities, are around every time you can reach out to somebody, across any kind of barrier that there may be, whatever it may be, race, gender, sexuality, whatever it may be, to get back into that reciprocity. And if you go to the websites of Indigenous nations, they're always offering invitations to visit, to participate, to learn. to go to Indigenous people to learn about an alternative way that they are practicing. So it's not a fantasy and it's not something just from the past. You know, it could be something that we all do. So it's just about re-educating, you know, and taking advantage of these opportunities. And there's many ways to do it. No one way.
Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap up now, unless anybody has last minute questions, or Lori, you have another point you want to make just in closing?
I've probably said enough. I probably said so much. And it, you know, I will just say it does start to seem like you're kind of just doing this, like it was good, it was bad, it was good, it was bad. That's why I talk about parallel universes, that two things were trying to exist that were mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. I've seen so much evidence for the one that was deemed too impractical and too idealistic and you know, not rational enough. I've seen too much evidence of that it could work to believe that it really needed to be marginalized like it was. So it was a lost opportunity. And why does it matter? You know, why does studying things that happened 200-300 years ago matter? Because it can teach us something about making different decisions today, so that we don't have to just inherit those decisions that were harmful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think this was really a wonderful, so sorry. Mark is asking, wasn't really quite so much a question as a comment. Why then were there so many killings in Europe from the beginning? Americans, that is true Americans, Native people lived together for 10,000 years. And unfortunately the comment says something like hitherto gained something or other, I don't know. But the contrast between the level of violence in Europe, which was, you know, bloodthirsty fighting, wars of religion, all the rest, decapitation and so forth, and the minimal violence, or, you know, wars and fighting, but much less violence in North America. I'm not sure that's a question.
Yeah. Well, it's an observation, and I think I'm no expert. And again, it's not too hard to go to Indigenous people and ask them what some of their thoughts are about this. But in my N of one, my limited study as one person, I can't think of any society outside of Indigenous societies that I see mostly in the Western Hemisphere, but I'm sure they're, you know, all across the world, that isn't based in the violence that we associate with Europe. There's something incredibly unique and powerful about Indigenous society. You know, the whole story of populating, you know, the isolation of the Western Hemisphere from the Eastern, I think they could be like an example. Like, these people had their own way and they were able to practice it forever before Europeans came. And so it was strong and it was powerful, and it was more powerful even than the onslaughts of colonization. I can't think of that happening, you know, anywhere else. It's a unique inheritance that people who are Indigenous in the Western Hemisphere have. And I don't know, I can't fully explain it. I'm not the person to turn to. I'm sure there are Indigenous people who can explain it to you, but they were on just such two different paths. I mean, I remember years ago listening to a tape of some kind of great lectures thing and said, think about how Indigenous people traveled from what is like northern Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. They just traveled it freely. They didn't have kingdoms and, you know, boundaries and possessive, like this is our, like there's nowhere else in the world that this happens. So unfortunately, the English people who came here, unable, unwilling to perceive that at all, couldn't even think for 5 seconds about Indigenous people. All I see is a chance to get wealthy. But luckily, they were not able to destroy that Indigenous society, so we could still turn to it and try to put it forward instead of the one that we have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really wonderful. You're getting lots of great comments, you know, that it was thought-provoking, enlightening. You know, that was a great answer. Many thanks. So I think we would clap for you if we were all in.
Well, it's great to be able to talk about this. I mean, the minute you say you study church records, Puritan church records, people fall asleep. And I would have been one of them, but
not now, and not for any of us. We'll all be waiting. We hope to see more from the Congregational Library's hidden histories. And we will be publishing an article about some of their 17th century holdings in the coming months.
Oh,
so
great.
Too. So I want to thank Lori, and then I want to alert everybody to two upcoming events that we have. The first one is on the 21st of February called Occupying Massachusetts. It is a presentation by Sandra Matthews, who's a photographer whose images you'll see if you look on the website now again. And they're just beautiful and evocative and powerful. And Dave Brule from the Nolumbeka project, and they will be speaking to us about the land and the work that David does at the project and the nature of photographing sort of the layers of history that you can when you look at what was Indigenous land or is still Indigenous land in Massachusetts. It's really stunning. So have a look. The other thing we hope, we're still working out the details, but we hope that the campaign to change the Massachusetts flag and seal will be speaking to us in March. This is a campaign that's gone town by town to kind of address on one hand, the original flag had a little sort of looked like folk art, but it was a demeaning image of Native people, and to try to create a flag of which everyone could be proud and happy rather than something that demeans and belittles an important part of this state and its original inhabitants. So that will be, I think, mid-March. So look out for that too. And we'll email you about it, but you can always check the website. So thank you everybody for coming. We'll follow up with a survey. Please do take the survey. We actually really do need your responses, believe it or not. Even those of you who have answered over and over again, we still want to hear from you. So please let us know or email us on phbostons@gmail.com. Okay, thanks everybody.